The scale and pace of job loss during the coronavirus outbreak was nearly unprecedented. And although some unemployed workers are getting hired back as reopening begins, the US is still a long way off from the pre-pandemic unemployment rate of 3.5%. After the 2008 financial crisis, it took over 6 years for the labor market to recover. In other recessions after World War II, it took between 1 and 4 years for the labor market to bounce back to peak employment levels.
The bad news is that although we're headed in the right direction, we started at such a bad point that the economic situation is still very bad.
Workers across all industries are experiencing job loss at a scale that's difficult to put into context.
One word that we hear a lot is historic, record-breaking, certainly something that we haven't seen since, I believe, the Great Depression.
The May jobless rate declined to 13.3%, which took Wall Street by surprise. It signaled the recovery from COVID-19 lockdowns was well underway. But the Federal Reserve predicts unemployment will still be at 9.3% by the end of 2020.
It just took us 2 months to get to 15% unemployment rate. So the speed of this crisis is extreme.
The drop that we saw in jobs, payroll employment, the spike in the unemployment rate, it is pretty much unprecedented for generations.
How far and how quickly can the economy bounce back from the rapid rise in unemployment? How much of the damage will last for years?
We went from having one of the strongest labor markets in about 50 years to just like that, essentially seeing millions of people file for unemployment each week.
The economy is kind of divided between those who have lost their job, those who have to continue going to work and risk their own health. And then the third group are those people like me who get to keep my job and get to work from home from the safety of my own home.
Around 21 million Americans are still unemployed. And although the gradual reopening of states has eased unemployment claims, numbers remain staggeringly high.
First it was retailers, retail workers, service industry workers, and people who had to come into contact with many others to do their job. First, we saw unemployment with that group.
Small businesses have been hit particularly hard, despite historic fiscal stimulus measures from the federal government.
Especially, I'm worried about the rate of failure of small businesses.
We're seeing that job losses are disproportionately impacting women. Also, a lot of African Americans are losing their jobs. I think it's also, we want to make sure that we're also looking at the group of people who have been frontline workers who are essential to stay in the economy. And so those workers, again, also are disproportionately Black workers, those workers working in grocery stores, transit workers, also healthcare workers.
The outbreak has disproportionately affected minority communities. 20% of Hispanic adults and 16% of African Americans report being laid off or furloughed since the outbreak started, compared with 11% of white workers, according to a Washington Post Ipsos poll.
So what happened at the beginning of this pandemic-driven recession is that you initially saw all these leisure and hospitality jobs lost. So people stopped traveling, right? The tourism industry basically came to a halt. And then you saw jobs lost in retail. You've seen jobs lost in education and health services.
Recent graduates could also be permanently impacted by entering the job market in a poor economy.
Entering a terrible job market is not only lowers their prospects for employment now, but many good studies have found that it can really harm their long-term career trajectories.
The recent jobs report shows a jobs increase of 2.5 million. However, a second wave of layoffs could hit sectors shielded from the initial job losses. But the report gives reason to hope the worst is behind the US, barring a second wave of COVID-19.
Now, one thing that we're seeing that some have said could be a sign of good news to come is that it looks like we may have already reached our peak and we're starting to slowly but it looks like we're starting to come down from the peak levels of unemployment.
During the Great Depression, the unemployment rate hit 25%. And the unemployment rate persisted at around 14% until World War II.
Even though this economic crisis had its roots in a health pandemic, it wasn't fundamentally economic recession, which makes it quite unique relative to other recessions that we've had.
A closer comparison may be the 1918 influenza pandemic.
The 1918 pandemic, like influenza typically does, affected young children, but surprisingly, it disproportionately affected individuals in their 20s and 30s. which are the working age population.
The 1918 flu killed 675,000 Americans and sickened millions more.
If we look at aggregate statistics, we can see a modest impact on industrial production, but even that recovered relatively quickly. And most other indicators, things that we're tracking today where we potentially see large effects, like a decline in GDP or a big increase in unemployment rates, those are not features that we saw during the 1918 pandemic.
Another factor was the lack of a social safety net. That forced workers to continue to go into factories and shops despite the risk of contracting the disease.
Firms did not shut down. Production did not shut down. Workers kept on going to work, even though sometimes that cost their lives.
Although there are some lessons to take from the 1918 pandemic, the societal changes over the last century make the current COVID-19 outbreak different in numerous ways.
There are two features for why that happened in 1918. Because of the war effort, there was high demand from the government for certain goods. There was an extreme need to produce them. And then the second factor is that the welfare state was extremely different at that time. We have unemployment insurance today. We did not have that in 1918.
In late March, Congress passed the CARES Act in response to the sudden economic strain caused by the coronavirus outbreak. Overall, the CARES Act contained about $2 trillion in government spending. A second stimulus bill has stalled as Republicans and Democrats have become mired in debate over costs.
Well, we need to keep getting money out to people, right? We've already seen some of those checks go out to households. We have seen an expansion of the unemployment insurance compensation system. That's been very important. There are many states that are still behind.
The recovery is helped when the firm-employee relationships are not disrupted.
Some economists think that keeping workers attached to their current employers will speed recovery once the outbreak lessens, versus layoffs and mass unemployment benefits.
People are desperate, not being able to pay their rent, not being able to pay their mortgage. They need those unemployment insurance checks to maintain any reasonable standard of living. So that is important. The next thing we need to do that we have been failing at doing is providing enough aid to state and local governments.
Some workers who were furloughed or laid off expected to return to their jobs relatively quickly. However, this may not be the case in practice.
We did a story, and it was based off of a study out of the Becker-Friedman Institute out of the University of Chicago, and it found that while most Americans who are unemployed describe themselves as temporarily unemployed, that may not be the case for up to 42% of people. And that is really a staggering statistic. And what they found is that in some cases, businesses will not survive coronavirus. A lot of restaurants have already closed their doors and have said that those closures will likely be permanent.
The coronavirus pandemic derailed one of the strongest labor markets and long-lasting economic expansions in recent history. Unlike the 2008 financial crisis, there wasn't an underlying financial disruption that caused the economic downturn. Economists are hopeful that once the outbreak gets under control, employment will slowly begin to return to lower levels. But the Federal Reserve predicts unemployment will still be 9.3% by the end of 2020.
I think we have to keep in mind that this is a different type of crisis for many of the economic crises and recessions that we've seen in the past. This is a crisis that has been created because of a health threat.
Whether we really recover and get well below an unemployment rate of 10% or not depends to a large degree on whether we see a renewed virus in the fall or the winter. Something like that where we have to shut down again could cause us to a very severe downwards spiral.
State and local governments are very much on the front lines of this crisis. They are going to be in danger of seeing huge budget cuts. They are required to balance their budget, so the federal government needs to step in to help them out to make sure that they can also provide the relief, provide the recovery, and stimulate the economy so when we get on the other side of this pandemic and the economy is really opened up, it can come back quickly.